If you could kill a tyrant and save the country, would you do it? Suppose you're the leader of a political faction in government, and there's an outsider who threatens to tear down the centuries-old institutions and traditions of your nation with all of you still inside. This is the situation that befell the Roman Senate in 44 BC when they orchestrated the assassination of Julius Caesar, the dictator for life of the Roman Republic. Caesar's assassination has been the subject of books, plays, adaptations, and other forms of media dating back to the time of the Romans themselves. The story, however, is almost always told from his perspective. Caesar was many things, but he was not a small figure. Arguably, the most common fact people could relay about the man was that he was assassinated by the Senate near the apex of his political career on the Ides of March 44 BC. Few people, in comparison, know of the Senate side of the story of an establishment under threat, relying on a litany of intelligent and established career politicians desperately trying to stop a war hero from tearing down the traditions built up in their society for hundreds of years. Rome was in crisis. The people were angry, and they felt that the government couldn't speak for them anymore. In this time, the Senate turned to radical violence as their last hope to preserve the institutions of Rome and save the country. This is the assassination of Caesar told from the perspective of one of the politicians that worked to uphold the Republic at its darkest and most tribulous hour. This is the story of Marcus Tullius Cicero. Rome's founding still remains largely unknown to historical scholars. Not much was written down, and what was written down rarely survived to the modern day. Most of what scholars in the modern day know about early Rome is from the stories written by Roman historians, who usually lack the scholastic rigor of historians in the postmodern period. With that being mentioned, the founding myth of Rome, as told and believed by the Romans, goes as follows. Rome was founded as a small city led by a king named Romulus, the descendant of the god of war, Mars. Romulus named the city after himself following an argument turned fratricide with his brother Remus. Rome was under the geopolitical thumb of a larger and more powerful civilization called the Etruscans to their north, who often meddled in their affairs. After a handful of kings, a powerful Etruscan man named Lucius Tarquinius Superbus became the king of Rome. Superbus ruled as a tyrant and a dictator, which was extra insulting to the Romans due to the fact that Superbus wasn't even one of them. His reign would end when his son, Sextus, raped a noblewoman named Lucretia. Lucretia took her own life, prompting her husband, Lucius Tarquinius Colanthius, alongside a political ally of his named Lucius Ionas Brutus, to lead a revolt against the monarchy, establishing themselves as consuls of the city against the foreign Etruscan menace. Rome operated from that point onwards as a republic, with two consuls acting as heads of government and the Senate acting as a legislative body. Consuls were elected every year by the Comitia Centuriata, which gathered every year on a date put forward by the magistrate. Any Roman citizen who happened to be in the city at the time could show up to vote, wherein they would be divided into different blocks based on their age and wealth, skewing older and richer. The wealthier and older voting blocks would cast their vote first, and subsequent votes would be cast only after the previous block's votes were counted and announced. Should a candidate meet the necessary votes before all votes were called, the election is concluded without input from the other blocks. The Comitia Centuriata would be given more executive power as time went on, including authority on civil and legal cases, although it was rarely, if ever, actually called upon for said cases. A large amount of power was placed in the consulship in the beginning days of the Republic, with consuls holding a large amount of control and only being checked by each other. Both consuls receive veto power over the other, or the idea of post-consulship legal repercussions. In times of dire straits, the consul and the Senate would appoint a dictator, who would rule for 6 months with supreme authority even over the elected consuls. For much of the early and middle Republic, the position of dictator was used only in the most dire circumstances, and the position was always surrendered willingly in the agreed-upon time by the dictator. This system relied mostly on tradition and respect for the customs of Roman law and politics, and would be tested a few times near the end of the Republican period, most notably by a man named Sulla, who was appointed dictator via a coup and sought to reform the constitution without regard for the Roman establishment. Sulla was successful in his coup and managed to strong-arm the Senate into appointing him as dictator in an unprecedented move. After Sulla's 6-month term was up and he rewrote the Roman constitution to his liking, he retired and left the position, causing a great amount of confusion and uncertainty following the events of his coup. Cicero was born in 106 BC in a small town to the southeast of Rome. From an early age, Cicero showed excellence in his studies, with his peers and mentors speaking highly of him and assuring him he would see great success in his life. Cicero would attend the lectures of Philo the academic, a renowned lecturer in Rome at the time, and further hone his studies under the professor. Cicero's first major opportunity came when a freed slave named Chrysogonus purchased an estate belonging to a recently executed man, and the man's son Roscius confronted Chrysogonus and accused him of lowballing the price. This was during the time of Sulla's dictatorship, and he became enraged at Roscus's confrontation, so he and Chrysogonus took the man to court with trumped up charges. Roscus couldn't find anyone willing to confront Sulla in court, so the desperate man turned to Cicero and asked him for help. Cicero's friends encouraged him to take the case, explaining there would be no better opportunity to put his name out there as a successful and competent orator. Cicero took the case, defended Roscus in court, and successfully won on behalf of his client. Fearing the retribution of Sulla, however, Cicero left Italy and made his way to Greece. While in Greece, Cicero further honed his oratory skills and political wit, and gained a reputation as a fiery and intelligent speaker. While studying in Greek universities, he met a friend named Titus Pomponius Atticus, who Cicero would write extensive letters to during his life and political career. After 2 years of mastering his craft and making connections amongst the educated and affluent Greeks, Cicero returned to Italy and ran as one of 20 candidates in the election for quaestor, winning the race and being appointed as a senator and representative of Sicily for life through the reforms pushed through by Sulla. At the beginning of Cicero's political career in Sicily, a grain shortage was ravaging the Roman Republic. Sicily was very agricultural based, and the Republic was putting pressure on Sicily to send more grain to the capital to combat the shortage. The men sent by the Senate to collect the grain doles were notorious for being greedy and extortionate, often taking far more than requested as payment for themselves. Cicero involved himself heavily in the situation, taking great care to ensure grain collection was fair and just, which quickly made him one of the most popular people in all of Sicily. Besides Cicero's handling of the grain shortage, little is actually known about Cicero's day-to-day governance of Sicily. What is known is that Cicero cultivated a popular support bloc in Sicily to grant himself more legitimacy. Despite his success in doing so, many of the Roman politicians still didn't take him very seriously. He was known as a competent quaestor, but he wasn't looked upon with any particular regard outside of his friends and a few political allies outside of Sicily. Cicero learned, after hearing from a friend, that although he had successfully handled the grain shortage in Rome, the Roman politicians largely didn't know or care who he was, that in order to be taken seriously, he had to work in the capital. He wrote in one of his letters that in order to advance his political career, he intended to go to the capital to make sure everyone of any importance saw him and saw what he was doing, a strategy that would prove one of the most pivotal things the senator could have possibly done. After moving to Rome and spending as much time as he could greasing the wheels of his compatriots and networking, Cicero ran for and was elected consul in 63 BC, running as a populist candidate that didn't threaten the established order. He won by a large margin, much to the chagrin of one of his competitors, a man named Catiline. In Roman politics, two schools of thought had begun to emerge, the populists and the aristocrats, broadly described as populares and optimates respectively. Cicero himself, although he utilized populist language, would gradually lean more towards the optimates side, as the populares began to coalesce around the rapidly rising political tide of Julius Caesar. Catiline, supported by Crassus and Caesar, believed himself deserving of the consulship due to his noble bloodline, but as Cicero became the political leader of the optimates faction, Catiline pivoted towards the populares and began attempting to rile up the people of Rome against Cicero, portraying him as acting against their best interests. Catiline ran for re-election under a populares bent, but still lost in part because of Cicero's political campaigning genius, including wearing armor under his toga to portray the threat that Catiline posed to both him, personally, and the Roman Republic. Catiline, after his second loss, began making plans to overthrow the Republic and take control of the consulship by force, something Cicero suspected Catiline would do but had no proof of until Crassus received a suspicious anonymous letter advising him to leave Rome immediately, and that Catiline was planning to launch an attack and slaughter many senators. Crassus, distressed, gave the letter to Cicero instead, who used the letter as a silver bullet to turn Catiline into a total pariah in Roman politics, confronting him on the Senate floor and delivering the Catiline orations, a dressing gown so legendary that Catiline fled the city in disgrace the night it was delivered. Catiline, still refusing to admit defeat, attempted to garner an army in Cisalpine Gaul and lead an attack on Rome. He still had men on the inside, but their carelessness allowed Cicero to rout them out, drag them in front of the Senate, and successfully argue for their execution. Once Catiline's last allies in Rome were killed, forces loyal to the Senate engaged Catiline in battle, killing him and ending the threat he posed to the Republic. Cicero, for his efforts in defending the Republic from Catiline, was highly lauded and hoisted up as a hero of Rome by the Senate. As Cicero had finally dealt with a major threat to the Republic seeking to use popular support to destroy the country's institutions, he had little time to rest before another threat presented itself in the form of Publius Claudius Pulcher, another popularis-aligned politician taking marching orders from Caesar. Claudius was elected tribune in 59 BC, a position that allowed him some special authority to intervene in senatorial matters. Claudius, unlike Catiline, initially soothed Cicero's concerns by assuring him he would be no threat to the established political order of Rome, and then, once tribune, quickly began whipping up popular support for his tribuneship and establishing gangs loyal to him to carry out his political dirty work. Interestingly, Claudius's rise coincides with the death of one of the members of now Pontifex Maximus Caesar's Agrarian Commission, a position which Caesar offered to Cicero if he were to switch sides, join the Populares, and do Caesar's bidding. Cicero refused the offer and told Caesar, quote, "I prefer to fight." Caesar would then leave Rome for Gaul with the intention of winning glory for himself and his allies by achieving the then thought impossible task of conquering Gaul. Claudius responded to Cicero's opposition by passing radical reforms on behalf of the common people of Rome, including handouts of grain, in order to win their support. Claudius bribed, or threatened, the consuls at the time to abandon Cicero and instead align themselves with himself and the Populares, something both consuls agreed to. Cicero's rallies were disrupted by Claudius's supporters, and at one point Claudius whipped up a mob into a frenzy that stormed into a Roman court procession, putting a Caesar-aligned legate named Publius Vatinius on trial, smashing up the place and forcing the trial to stop, the first time political violence was used to stop judicial processes in Rome. Cicero's list of allies were growing thinner by the day, and Claudius's extrajudicial gangs gave him control and authority over Rome. Fearing the rising political tensions and violence promoted by Claudius and the Populares that supported him, Cicero fled Rome in the middle of the night, eventually leaving Italy altogether. Once Cicero left, Claudius forced the Senate to approve a bill exiling Cicero by name and seizing all of his property. After spending a year in exile, Rome was in chaos due to Claudius's gangs, and Cicero was invited back to Rome, where he arrived to cheering crowds. Cicero and Pompey made an alliance against Claudius, whose influence was waning in this period, and Cicero successfully appealed to the pontiffs for the return of his property, which was granted. Claudius would continue terrorizing Rome with his mob of gangsters until 52 BC, when another man named Milo with another set of gangsters encountered him north of Rome, and a scuffle broke out between their two armed entourages that turned into a brawl. The brawl saw Milo's group, which was larger, victorious, and Claudius slain on the road. In gratitude for Milo killing Claudius, Cicero defended him when he was called to the Senate, and assisted him in his political pursuits. After Claudius's death, Cicero became the governor of Cilicia, although Cicero himself described the appointment as, quote, contrary to his wishes and unexpected, unquote. Cicero nonetheless took up the task of governing the eastern province starting in 51 BC, wherein he initially focused on dealing with corrupt officials in an attempt to stabilize the area. Crassus, one of Caesar's most steadfast allies, had recently died in battle against the Parthians, and Cicero was given Crassus' former position as an augur. Cicero's fair and just governance of the province gained him many allies in the region, and the respect from the soldiers and officials living in Sicilia. During this, Pompey and Cato became the main opponents of Caesar back in Rome. As Caesar's military campaign in Gaul was wrapping up alongside his time as proconsul, he, correctly, believed that he would be prosecuted by the Senate for actions undertaken during the Gallic Wars and because of his rising political influence. The Senate, under Pompey, notified him that he was relieved of his command and to return to Rome to stand trial. Caesar's allies in the Senate protested this decree by leaving Rome and traveling north to meet him, joining up with his forces in Cisalpine Gaul. On January 11, 49 BC, Caesar arrived at the Rubicon River, which divided Cisalpine Gaul from Italy. Caesar was accompanied by his army and crossed the river without surrendering his command, officially defying the Senate's orders and starting the civil war. Caesar made it to Rome with lightning speed, with Pompey and many of those loyal to the Senate fleeing the city and allowing Caesar to march in virtually unopposed. Cicero attempted to placate both sides, but had clear allegiances towards Pompey over Caesar. The most important battle of the civil war would come at Pharsalus, when Pompey's forces were decisively defeated. Pompey demanded Cicero to intervene in his behalf, which Cicero refused to do. Pompey, enraged, attempted to kill Cicero while he was in Pompey's military camp, but Cato helped Cicero escape to Brundisium and avoid Pompey's wrath. Caesar would win the civil war in 45 BC, with Pompey fleeing to Egypt and being murdered by Cleopatra's forces, with his head being presented to Caesar. Almost immediately, conspirators in the Senate began worrying about Caesar enshrining more power than himself than even Sulla had done. In a similar fashion to the ancient conspiracy long ago that killed Superbus and founded the Roman Republic, two men, Longinus and Brutus, began to plot against Caesar. In February of 44 BC, Caesar appointed himself dictator for life. This was the final act that pushed a lot of previously neutral senators over the edge and convinced them to go along with the plan. Caesar had spent his political career trying to rip the Republic apart, and after directly or indirectly supporting demagogues like Catiline and Claudius, disregarding the Senate's authority and starting a bloody civil war that left the nation in chaos, many soldiers dead, and one of the most highly regarded and respected senators as a head in a basket. Now, after everything, Caesar declared himself perpetual dictator of the Republic in the latest of a series of violations of Roman institutions. On the Ides of March 44 BC, Caesar the dictator arrived in the Senate for a regularly scheduled session. When everyone was seated and the session began, during the presentation of one of the petitions for Caesar to deliberate on, He was grabbed by some senators who took out knives and stabbed Caesar to death, with the final blow being delivered by Brutus. Cicero himself wasn't invited to the conspiracy and was surprised to see it occur, but later wrote that he wished he had been invited, and that he would have urged the conspirators to go further and kill Mark Antony as well as Caesar. The assassination of Caesar threw Rome into a tailspin of chaos and disorder. He was much more popular than the conspirators assumed, and the people of Rome were outraged at his death and called for revenge. The next month, the assassins fled Rome as people began erecting statues to Caesar and offered prayers to him. In the chaos, Mark Antony became the de facto heir to Caesar, commanding the Senate through popular will afterwards. Cicero was disgusted at the reverence for the late dictator, which totally enraged Mark Antony and put Cicero squarely in the forceps of the rapidly coalescing Second Triumvirate. Cicero would jump back into action, trying to fix the rapidly deteriorating situation the Republic found itself in, but to no avail. Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus had taken control of the city and wrote up a list of enemies to be hunted down and killed to avenge Caesar. Cicero was one of the highest marks on the list and was confronted by Antony's men in his villa. Cicero was taken in for execution, to which he did not resist, and was beheaded in 43 BC. Cicero was many things, but few could deny he wasn't an intelligent and savvy politician. There was a tendency, due to the vindication of Caesar by Octavian and his allies and successors, to side with Caesar and grant him the benefit of the doubt when discussing his role in the fall of the Roman Republic. Caesar was actively pushing the limits of the authority in which he was vested. He supported demagogues who severely damaged the Republic and threatened to kill sitting senators, and he caused a civil war that brought massive damage to the country for the cause of advancing his own glory and legacy, something he was obsessed with achieving ever since the beginning of his career. Cicero was at the forefront of the defense of the Republic against Caesar for most of this. Ironically, the one major event Cicero wasn't involved in was the actual assassination itself. The assassination is often portrayed as the downfall of the Republic due to the actions of the Second Triumvirate after Caesar's death, but considering Caesar's previous actions and the power he consolidated in himself, had he continued his tenure as dictator, there's a real possibility that the Republic would have been eroded so badly that it ended up becoming an emperor either way. If you were involved in the conspiracy, as a senator who had lived through Sulla's dictatorship, Catiline's conspiracy, Claudius's gangs terrorizing Rome, and the civil war started by Caesar, and saw him appoint himself as dictator for life after all of it, I'll reiterate the question posed at the start of this video. Would you have done it?